Hello and welcome to One on One. I'm Vernon Ramison. I'm very pleased to say my guest today is Dr. David Brotherton, Professor of Sociology at City University, New York, and a renowned criminologist. Professor, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'm a bit disappointed. I was told you'd show up in a Hawaiian shirt. So we'll have to do with you looking sort of a little more stately.
Yeah.
First of all, perhaps you can give us an idea of your background in criminology and your interest in gangs, because you were here to speak about the, was it Gangs, Guns, Drugs and Murder at the UTT Distinguished Lecture Series over the weekend. How did you first start getting interested in the sociology of gangs?
Well, you know, I come from a certain part of London which had a long sort of delinquent history. It's called the East End of London. So I sort of grew up around a lot of street subcultures. It was just part of my socialisation. And then when I went to university, especially graduate school, I started to work with kids in danger of dropping out from high school. And I was a high school teacher in San Francisco. It was then that I started to really focus on the issue of gangs in schools and street gangs and youth gangs in general. And then I got my PhD, continued working at, on a postdoctoral studies at Berkeley and looked at the relationship between gangs and schools. Most studies had been on gangs in the street, but this was an area that had been overlooked. And I wrote about, you know, that gangs actually weren't necessarily anti-school. The kids in gangs weren't necessarily anti-school. They were more anti the kind of education and the treatment they were getting in schools, which was kind of counterintuitive. I moved then to New York City, where I was the only social scientist in the gang task force in the biggest public education system in the United States, in the school system. And I looked in some of the worst schools in New York City for 2 years. And the issue supposedly was gangs in schools, and it wasn't. There were all these other issues. There were gangs in schools, but they weren't the main issue vis-a-vis violence. So it was again another kind of counterintuitive finding. And then I started working with perhaps the largest gang in the United States, a group called the Latin Kings and Queens. And its leader had just received the most severe prison sentence in the US since the Second World War. He received over 200 years in prison and the first 45 years to be spent in solitary confinement. And he was put in a special unit in Florence. It's a supermax prison in Colorado. And so I started to work with this group, and of course, again, you know, the presumption was this was an ultra-violent gang, criminal, deviant, and so on and so forth. And I found it to be quite the opposite. I found it actually to be a fairly politicised group. There were elements that were obviously deviant, but it was actually much more complex. So constantly, when I started to work with gangs, I kept finding things that were quite contrary to the studies and the conclusions in the research, and so I began to write in a very different frame and a very different interpretation of the gang. And in fact, I stopped calling them gangs and wrote about them in the early 2000s as a street organisation, because the term gang had become so pejorative that anything, 3 or 4 people standing on a street corner, particularly if they were black and Latino, were said to be a gang. And of course, you know, it was rubbish. And but a street organisation was much more, for me at least, something which was described a group as an organisation that had goals and had ideas and perhaps even ideologies and practices that we had to define and we had to understand as social scientists, rather than just say they're all the same, they're all wearing colours, therefore they're all gang members. No, I think the proof of the pudding was actually in the research rather than in this labelling which was going on.
So basically your academic career has been about overturning conventional wisdom to a large extent.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, gang structures are not dissimilar to other structures within our society.
Absolutely.
And you're studying them in that context, is that it?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of gangs look like fraternities in universities. I mean, they're quite similar with rituals of entry.
Somebody had mentioned the Freemasons, for example.
Yeah, Freemasons. I mean, they're semi-secret societies. But they differ because it depends on the community they come out of. It's very difficult to understand the gang without understanding the community. They're embedded one in the other. And so when you do a study really of a gang, you should really do a study of the community to really understand the context out of which it comes.
Now, we do a lot of talk in this country about gangs. In terms of misconceptions that people have about the gang culture, what would you say would be the biggest misconception?
Well, one of them is that they're all necessarily violent. I mean, the proof in the pudding is in the United States. You know, the FBI at the moment, you know, estimates there's about, you know, 800,000 gang members in the United States. And 15 years ago, they also estimated there were 800,000 gang members in the United States. And we all know that the violence rate in the United States has declined appreciably. But you still have the same amount of gang members. It doesn't make sense, right? If we were formerly saying that the reason the violence was on the increase is because there were so many gang members, and now we have the same amount of gang members, much less violence, then we need to change our perceptions, our conceptions, our conclusions about the gang. The problem is we don't. We carry on with the same old ideas, with the same old tautologies, and we end up with a very bad policy, unfortunately.
Do gangs evolve? As you mentioned, the fact that violent crime has gone down. I guess like any organization, a gang can gradually, as time goes by, develop changes within its structures and its focuses.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the issues with gangs historically, and the other thing is about studying the gang, you need history. And unfortunately, much social science, a lot of sociology, a lot of criminology, there's no history in it. So you're just studying the group in the here and now without understanding, you know, what the history of that community was 20, 30, 40, 50 years, or country even. So yeah, the gang has evolved. So originally, when gangs were studied, mainly from the School of Chicago, which is a sociological school, they hypothesized that the gang would diminish over time as people in gangs became integrated into society. Many of these gangs were either immigrant gangs or they were gangs coming African Americans migrating from the south into the city for the first time. But what's happened is that obviously over time we've actually got, you know, as many gangs as we've ever had. But most of the gangs actually are not white. So, you know, the obvious conclusion is that whites in American society have found pathways to integrate, but many blacks and Latinos and other people of colour have found obstacles to their integration. And one of the ways of handling that obstacle or handling that social exclusion is to form these subcultures, which are ways to survive, to give meaning to people, to give themselves an alternative identity. Now, what's happened over time is that because of, you know, the kind of racism and the racial blockages in the United States, we've permanently excluded a large section of society. That's why the prison population is 2.4 million, for example. And what's happened is that the gang becomes more permanent than something which is temporary and will fade away. So the gang has become kind of a quasi-institution of the street, as opposed to what it was thought of as a temporary kind of, survival mechanism as a group merged into society. And this is new. The other thing which has changed is that we're no longer talking about street corner groups. We're in a globalised society. We have social media. People migrate from one country to another looking for work. We also deport millions of people in the United States. We've deported millions of people, 400,000 a year on average in the last 8-9 years. And many of those young people who are deported, or a number at least, have gang subcultures as part of their identity. And so they take their group with them, or their identity with them. You see this in Central America, for example. And so,
to some extent here as well, I understand.
Well, there is probably some of that in Trinidad. I don't know. But anyway, the point is that there are all these factors, external factors, that have created some changes within the group. Yeah.
You mentioned the idea of race playing into the whole narrative there. The fact that in the U.S. certainly we've got a lot of gangs that are largely black or Hispanic. Does that also color how we view them from a sociological perspective? There's an element of racism in how we regard gangs?
Oh, sure, absolutely. I mean, we know, you know, part of the racial ideology, white supremacist ideology in the United States is to fear the black male, and the black male is often associated with violence, with drugs, with all kinds of pathologies, right? And the gang is kind of, if you like, it's an umbrella. You know, it's holding, you know, a by-station of all of these pathologies in one. It's violent, you know, it's threatening, it can cause mayhem, it's antisocial. I mean, you think of all the negative things you could point to a person, the characteristics, and you stick it in the gang, and it's one kind of every man's kind of disorder, every man's pathology. And then you stick that next to black and Latino, and you have the ultimate folk devil. and with this plays into racial ideologies and reproduction of racial structures.
No, is the idea of gang culture, is that particular to the modern world, or there's sort of analogies to it as we go back historically?
Well, gangs originally weren't really associated with blackness or brownness or anything else. They were originally talked about in terms of youth who were displaced by the Industrial Revolution. I mean, they were first written about in London. These were kids coming from rural areas and trying to grow up on the streets of London, and they were called gangs. And they were basic, but they were poor, right? And the gangs that they talked about in New York in the 1870s and 80s in the Bowery, they were mainly Irish immigrants or nativists. The Gangs of New York is a film by Martin Scorsese, and in that there's a couple of black members of the different gangs, but they're mainly white. But they're really in the poor, very poor neighbourhoods of what's called the Bowery, or then the 5 Points district. And so they were associated mainly with poverty, but they were understood more as a kind of, with much more empathy, much more humanistic understanding, rather than simply fear. The other thing, one should understand how many people in the United States made it from the gang into legitimate, society. The former mayor of Chicago, a guy called I forget his name, but anyway, the former mayor of Chicago was in the Hamburg gang, and he then became the mayor of Chicago. You always see this in many walks of life, that people actually made it into esteemed positions of political power, had formerly been in gangs, but obviously disavow their past. But we never associate that, with some kind of gang history.
Now, in as much as your work is about overturning conventional wisdom has it that gang members really come from marginalized and disenfranchised groups within our society. Is that in fact correct?
Yes, that's mostly correct. But you must understand that not all gang members come from one-parent families. Not all gang members come from fragmented, lower-class families. They often come from fairly stable families, actually. But they join the gang for excitement, for a sense of identity, for drama and so on and so forth. So you got to be careful. I mean, that's why we need studies that actually talks to gang members rather than talks about gang members without having any real connection to them.
Now, one of the things we often hear mentioned in this country, certainly at the government level, is that sport is the solution to our gang problem. Is that really as facile as it sounds in terms of?
Well, I mean,
solutions?
For young people, adolescents trying to find themselves, 14, 15 years of age, trying to forge an identity, trying to, find a way to do meaningful things, take care of their body, perhaps engage in competitions against other groups. Sport, I grew up, playing a lot of sports, and I think, the more sport, the better. And so, and it's no coincidence there's so many sports facilities in schools have been cut back in the United States, whilst we've seen a kind of a gang boom, as it were. But no, it's not the solution. It's one of many things that we need to do to really, fashion a whole range of resources for young people within which they can find themselves. And the key is to empower themselves. Kids are looking for, a way to do things in life, to be active, to be proactive, not to be just sitting there and be told what to do, or to be blamed with this or blamed with that. That simply pushes them away and alienates them, and the gang becomes a kind of recipient of those people who feel alienated on many different levels. Again, education is terribly important, but that education is, again, not the panacea. It's not the be-all and end-all. And then what do we mean by education anyway? If we mean like simply you have to remember these facts, this body of knowledge, otherwise you won't graduate, otherwise you won't pass the grade, otherwise you won't get a job, then you're learning through threat, right? You're learning by some kind of compulsion, as opposed to kind of engendering and cultivating, that intrinsic love of knowledge and a kind of curiosity to develop. That's what we need to do, and a kind of refreshingly new pedagogy that's gone completely out of sort of everyday practice due to so much testing especially in the United States.
So basically, there is no single solution to dealing with gangs.
No, it's a holistic issue, and therefore it has to be approached holistically.
I guess the problem is many governments don't operate holistically.
Absolutely.
And there's a political expectation you want to be seen to strong-arm your way to solve a problem.
Absolutely. You want quick solutions, kind of the magic bullet, as it were, Band-Aid solutions, because, the problem becomes highly politicized. But the problem is a social problem, right? The problem with gangs is a social problem. It's also an economic problem, a cultural problem, so on and so forth. Therefore, it's a very complex problem. But we've run out of, that's sort of passé to think about things complexly. We want one or two word sound bites. We want, this one equals that, and then we cut that out of the problem and we get the solution. That's not the way it works. None of us work that way. As I say to, my students oftentimes, I said, if I ask you to describe your life to me, you're going to sit down and you're going to narrate a very complex history, right? With about your mom and your dad and your grandmother when you came here, and you won't shortchange yourself, right? Anybody, any working class, middle class person, will do the same thing because they respect themselves. But when we talk about gang kids, it's all about violence or their relationship to drugs or sex, as if they're kind of cardboard cutouts or anything but that. And so we have to get back to a conversation that respects the humanity of people and the complexity of their human existence and the human history.
Because a large part of the conversation is about dehumanizing gang members, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And you don't tend to get a realistic solution if you're dealing with something you don't regard as human.
No, and we have increasingly this tendency, this penchant to dehumanize people, especially when it comes to talking about crime. And it's very, very dangerous. It's a juggernaut. Once you start to dehumanize people, you come up with these constant kind of pejorative adjectives about somebody, and it's very difficult to stand back and reverse yourself.
Well, we had a former Minister of National Security who referred to them as cockroaches.
Well,
I guess that's not probably very constructive, is it?
They're often related to insects or animals. So they're often seen as as you say, cockroaches or rats in a cage, or wolves as a predator, all of these kind of metaphors which connote threat and othering, right? They're the other.
Us and them. Yeah.
Definitely us and them. On every single level, such that we can't even recognize them anymore. They're so dehumanized. And, again, once you get into that dehumanizing kind of spectrum and juggernaut, it's very, very dangerous. I mean, don't forget, fascism is built on dehumanization. The notion of the Untermensch, vis-a-vis the Jews, is very effective when you're looking for reasons to eliminate a certain group, to purge a certain group from society. And we know what road that goes there once you start going there. And we have to be terribly careful when we begin to sort of call on all these kind of simplistic notions, especially in terms of controlling crime. And creating a better sense of social control for the betterment of society.
Given the complexity of the whole thing, I suppose there's no one-size-fits-all approach, is there? I mean, It would depend on country. Even within a country, it may depend on the region. It may depend on any number of things.
Absolutely. You can compare countries. We can compare the situation in Trinidad with Jamaica, with Dominican Republic. Yeah, we can do, and we can see certain similarities. But we can see obviously very obvious differences, and it's that sort of amalgam of the same and different on which we can begin to form a viable policy for the long term, not the short term, for the long term.
Do you know anywhere where it's actually been successful, where they've taken a complex approach to dealing with a complex problem and had a reduction in criminal activity that's related to gangs?
Absolutely. I mean, to some degree, out of the work that we did in the 90s. And the books that we wrote and so on and so forth. There were programs in Spain, in Barcelona, in Genoa, Italy. Now there's a national program in Ecuador where they actually took this much more kind of humanistic approach to the gang. And instead of calling them gangs, in Spain, in Barcelona, for example, they called them cultural groups of immigrants. And they the public security system or apparatus began a whole, kind of system of negotiations with the group, face-to-face kind of interactions with the group, and they even allowed them to meet in council properties so that they could develop their own kind of organisations, because they didn't fear them as an organised crime group. And actually, what happened is that what had been happening is there had been disputes between this group and another group, and and it had actually been a couple of deaths, not anything like here, but it had been a couple, and that ended. They said there were less conflicts, there was less violence, and there was almost there's been a complete end to actually any homicides. It's changed now because there's a more conservative government in Barcelona, but there was a period where we could actually evaluate the new policies over 6 or 7 years, and in fact the city of Madrid, the capital of Spain, chose the repressive model from the United States, the zero tolerance model. And in fact, the records of conflicts between these different groups, it spiked and increased quite appreciably. In Ecuador, there's what's called a national security program, so the integral national security policy. I forget the name of it, but it's where it's a policy in which they define security holistically. So security for them is not simply border security. Security is not simply against the deviants and criminal organisations or terrorism. Security is everything. Security from hunger, security from unemployment, security from ill health. All of these things are part of their notion of security. And into that body of knowledge about and framework of thinking about security is the gang. And so they've started this whole program now running for the last 8 years, in which they actually reach out to these very large gangs. We're talking about groups here with 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 members, right? Nationwide. And they work with them as organisations, as street organisations, which came directly out of our work. And in fact, with one of the groups, they actually gave them $1 million contract to build their own community centre, in which they could train people from the neighbourhood and give them all kinds of other opportunities that they felt that the state couldn't reach. So the point is that the state recognised that there's certain kids that we can't reach, but the gangs can. Right? And it's whatever the reason is, maybe we don't have the legitimacy, maybe they're in these nooks and crannies of society where they prefer, whatever it is. But the reality is we can't reach them. Now, so they said, well, how do we reach them? We need to reach them. We need to bring them into some, the more mainstream of society. So let's negotiate. Let's talk to them and figure out what they want, instead of constantly pushing them away, thinking that all they're going to do is planning a conspiracy against us.
So the gangs become a vector then for positive change within communities.
And the gangs change. The gangs begin to become involved in these, other kind of fairly mainstream activities based on their needs as youth, right? And what they're into, hip hop or whatever the cultural form is, and they begin to gain self-confidence with other members of society, people they perhaps wouldn't negotiate with before, like police officers or teachers or politicians, and as they begin that kind of process of communication and interaction, they change themselves. I mean, that's how you change. You change yourselves not simply thinking about how you'd like to be, but by being what you'd like to be, right? And right. So it changes their self-conception, it changes their practice, and they become a completely different entity with which society can deal.
We have about 2 minutes left. I have to ask you, in all you said there, I suppose one of the elements that really is important is politics, isn't it? Because politicians are afraid of being seen to be soft on crime, and some of the activities you mentioned there would be perceived as being soft on crime.
Absolutely.
The previous administration in this country at certain points was referring to gang members as leaders as community leaders. And there was a strong backlash against that. They were seen to be somehow colluding with gangs. How do you balance the two?
Well, I'm not trying to be totally idealistic here and saying they're not doing this and they're not doing that. Some are, some aren't. But I'm being very realistic. We need to know actually what they're doing and what makes up their life, all the kind of networks they have, the relationships they have with society as mums, dads, children, and so on and so forth. And in terms of, we have to resist, I understand, the getting soft, or it's not a binary thing, right? It's not about getting tough. And it's not about getting soft, it's about getting real. And that's our big problem. And if we could, it's about being pragmatic, really, and recognising that, that these kids are all our kids. They're not simply their kids. If we want a really unified nation state, then we all have to be in this together. And we're part of the solution, but we're also part of the problem.
And I guess also starting to think about them as also being us.
Exactly.
Which I guess is one of the problems that we have basically, is that we have to break away from that us and them whole scenario.
Absolutely. There's lots of things that they do that we can learn a tremendous amount from. Rather than saying we're the ones with the answers, we're simply the models with this kind of patronising, arrogant way. And being sort of humble and being self-reflective and saying, well, we've done quite a few things wrong here. Let's get together to change the way forward. But we're going forward nonetheless.
Well, Dr. Brotherton, this has been a fascinating discussion. I thank you so much for being on the program. It was a great
Thank you.
pleasure having you here. Thank you very much. You've been watching One on One. Join us again tomorrow for another edition.